Excuse me.
Great. I'm going to go ahead and start the webinar, and I'm going to start with a little share screen, and we'll go from there.
Okay.
Thank you. I need to. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll be starting in just a moment. We'll just let a few more people join in, and we'll begin in a moment. Well, welcome. I'm Kevin Bowling. I'm the Executive Director of the Secular Student Alliance. Before we begin the webinar, I just want to do a couple of housekeeping things. One, we'll be having a great conversation with Jeff Hawkins today. And after that, we'll have sort of the conversation, and then after that, we'll have a Q&A portion. So if you want to ask questions, we have the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to put your questions there, and I'll be able to feed those to Jeff. We're also live streaming this on social media. So if you are on Twitter or Facebook, we do have staff that are watching those. So please feel free to put your questions there as well. And those will be fed to us so that we can ask those to Jeff as well. So everyone involved is participatory in the session today. So, and just coming up, before we sort of begin, we do have our annual conference is going to be virtual again this upcoming year. So I encourage you to participate. It is open to everyone, so we'd love to have you participate. I'll be including a link for that in the chat later on in the session during the Q&A part. So, but it's May 15th and 16th, 2 days virtual conference. We'll be re-airing this presentation as part of that. So other people who weren't able to attend today will be able to get a chance to see it as well. So great. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm happy to have Jeff Hawkins here today with us. So just a quick little bio. So Jeff is the scientist and co-founder of Numenta, a research company focused on how the cortex learns a predictive model of the world through sensation and movement. So in 2002, Jeff founded the Redwood Neuroscience Institute, which is currently located at UC Berkeley. He previously founded two companies, Palm and Handspring, both of which I was customers of. So it's a long-term relationship that Jeff and I have had unknowingly. In 2004, Jeff wrote his first book on intelligence about cortical theory. And Jeff has also been a longtime supporter of the Secular Student Alliance and supporting critical thought and curiosity and compassion in students. So it's great having you here today, Jeff.
Thanks, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be here. Obviously, as you said, we've worked together for a number of years, and the Secular Student Alliance is one of my favorite organizations, and I really cherish the work you guys do.
Well, wonderful. And I'm very pleased to have you here today. And we're here to talk about your new book, which came out officially last month. So 1,000 Brains, A New Theory of Intelligence. And it's considered a big think book unveiling a new theory of intelligence that's going to revolutionize our understanding of the brain and the future of AI. So, and I was telling you a little bit before, so this isn't, this is a really easy to read book about some really big concept. And it's not a research paper. It's not in that realm, but it's really presenting sort of some big concepts and things for us to talk about and discuss, and not only looking back a little bit and what we've learned, but also in the future as well.
Yeah, well, I hope it's a revolutionary book. I don't think I use that. I don't think I use that exact words, but I do think the ideas are pretty important. So.
Well, good. So I think that's probably what's been written about the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think other people might have said that.
So yeah. So in the beginning of your book, you sort of describe a little bit of your journey leading up to starting Numenta. So, and during that time, and I'm picking out two tiny little examples, but you were told at one point, the brain is a messy computer and there's no point in studying it. And at Berkeley, you were told that trying to develop an overall theory of brain function is considered too ambitious and too risky. Yet you've spent a considerable amount of your time striving to understand the brain. So with all of that, why has this been a passion of yours, and why this book?
Well, it has been a passion of mine for, probably 40 years or close to 40 years. And it's kind of odd because I think everyone is sort of interested in the brain a bit in some sense. I mean, we are our brain. We all have a brain. We all think. My brain is speaking and your brain is listening. And it really defines our species. So I fell in love with the brain after reading an essay by Francis Crick, in which he said, we have all these facts about the brain, but we really have no theory which holds it all together. And he wrote this back in 1979. And I just struck me, my God, this is something we can do in my lifetime. We can solve this problem, how this organ works. And it seems to be, to me, it was like at the core of humanity and the core of everything. And, a part of your organization, we deal with people having belief systems, and the brain is the organ of belief systems. So, if we want to understand why people believe things, we need to understand how the brain works. So it just became a passion of mine, as you pointed out. And I've been pursuing it pretty much full time, as much as I can, for 40 years. There was a period of time, as you mentioned, during that, where after I was basically kind of, as a graduate student at Berkeley, told I couldn't do this. I couldn't study overall brain theory because, as you said, it was considered too ambitious, and that was therefore too risky. That I went back in the industry for a while, and that's when I started Palm and Handspring. But my passion has always been brains. And so as soon as I had the opportunity, I started the Redwood Neuroscience Institute, and now Numenta, which is a private research company. We have about 10 scientists, and that's what we do. We study, we are theorists, brain theorists. We publish our work in scientific journals, but they're really hard to read. They're biology papers and neuroscience papers. They're not for your average person. And so in the last 5 years, actually over the last 15 years, but really in the last 5 years, we made some huge progress in understanding what's going on in our head. I mean, we have now a really good picture of what's happening at the neuron level. What's going on when you're thinking and seeing and moving about the world. And so I wrote the book because I think it's an important thing for everyone to know. And so I wrote it in a way that most people can understand it. And that's the first part of the book, that what we've learned about how the brain works.
Well, that's great. And let's starting to talk about the book. The book is written in 3 parts. And I almost each part could be its own little mini book, but they definitely build upon themselves. So I'd love for you just to give us sort of the Cliff Notes overview of sort of, and share what you feel is sort of important about each part of the book. And then we'll go into a little bit more in depth about each part.
Yeah. My wife had the same comment. She said, gee, you could have written 3 books. And but they do tie together. And I wanted to present them as a whole. The first section of the book, the largest section, is about the brain theory. It's about what we've learned about the brain and how neurons understand the world and what's happening when you're thinking. And we can talk about that some more. That is the key part of the book. The second section of the book is about AI, artificial intelligence. And I'm a big, I have no bones to pick with today's AI, but it's not intelligent. And can you still see me and hear me? Hello? I lost.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, because your screen went blank. I'm not sure why that is. Um, there you are. You're back, Kevin. The second part is about AI, and basically what we've learned about the brain gives us a blueprint for building truly intelligent machines. And it explains a lot of the mysteries about AI and how to think about intelligent machines, and will they be conscious, and what are the risks associated with them. And so our brain theory informs us on some really new ideas about that. So that's the section part of the book, just going through its impacts on the future of artificial intelligence. And the third part of the book, which in some ways may be the most interesting to people in the secular movement, perhaps, is just talking about the human intelligence and thinking about the human species as an intelligent species. And what have we learned about the brain, which might change the way we think about ourselves and think about the future of humanity. I cover in that third section, I cover, why we have false beliefs and the nature of false beliefs. What are we, I even go into the depths of like, what are we trying to preserve as a species as we go forward in time? Is it our intelligence or our genes? And so I develop a series of logical arguments about thinking about, well, when we really understand what intelligence is, which this book makes a very cogent argument what intelligence is, then we might think about our future differently too. So those are the three parts of the book.
Fantastic. And let's sort of jump into part one. So, which is really it's almost half the book. So it's really dedicated to talking about the human brain, describing your research, and laying out sort of the premise, and then really the thousand brain theory. Yeah. And so you start with the details of some of the past theories of the brain, how your research is built upon that. And I think for many of us, and including myself, is a little bit of the reminder of the limited education we got about the brain in school. But you also focus on the importance of the neocortex, and that's clearly your baby in this. Yeah. So you cover the old brain, its relationship to the new brain, the detail of the physical structure of the neocortex. So before we talk about the thousand brain theory, can you give us a little primer about what makes the neocortex so special and how it relates to intelligence? Yeah, so the neocortex is the wrinkly part of your brain when you look at a brain from the outside. So we've all seen pictures or drawings of brains, and it's a sheet of cells or sheet of neural tissue. It's about 2.5 millimeters thick, and it's about the size of a large dinner napkin, and it gets wrinkled up to fit in your head, and it wraps around the other parts of the brain. The neocortex is about 70%, or almost 3/4 the volume of your brain. So our head is big because we have a large neocortex, and the neocortex. By the way, all mammals have a proper neocortex, and it's one of the attributes that defines a mammal. Ours is particularly large relative to our body size, and it's what makes us intelligent. It is the organ of intelligence. So when we think about seeing the world or hearing things or listening to music or touching objects or thinking about our school or how to run a computer to do a webinar, that's the neocortex doing all that stuff, our arts and our literature and our science. So this one organ is incredibly powerful thing. It's really it's the foundation of all of our language and mathematics and spoken language and sign language, et cetera. And now, so that's what we want to study. There's other parts of the brain, of course, are very, very important. There's lots of other parts. They control our bodily functions, our emotions, our reflex reactions, and so on. And you can't really think of the brain as completely separated. The neocortex interacts with these other parts of the brain. But the remarkable thing about the neocortex, and this is just incredibly, it's hard to believe actually, is that the different parts of it do different things. So there's areas here that do language, and areas that do vision, and areas that do touch, and areas that do high-level thinking and planning and so on. Everything that we do is in there. But when you look at the actual detailed structure, like you look under a microscope and you look at the neurons and how they're connected, and it's very complex, it looks almost identical everywhere. That the parts that do language look like the parts that do vision, which look like the parts that do touch, which looks like the parts of thinking about engineering and things like that. And so it was speculated many years ago by a famous neuroscientist, Vernon Mountcastle, that the reason the different parts of the neocortex look the same is that they're actually doing the same thing. And in that you could take a section of this neocortex, and if you connect it to eyes, you get seeing. And if you connect it to ears, you get hearing. If you connect it to your skin, you get touch sensation. And if you connect other regions to each other, you get things like language and high-level thought. So this is an incredible idea that was published in a very famous monograph many years ago. And some people just have trouble believing it, but there's overwhelming evidence for it.
So one of our jobs is to understand how the neocortex works. Is you don't have to understand. The problem is to find out what is common about all the things we think about of intelligence. What is the common function that underlies all the vision and hearing and touch and language, and understand. If you figure out how the cortex does one of those things, then you figure out how it does everything, and that it just seems almost impossible to be true, but it is true. And what I guess if I would summarize it, what we figured out is, what does the neocortex do as a whole, and what are those individual components are doing? It's actually divided up into these 150,000 columns. And what are those columns doing? So we've kind of figured out the basic architecture and function of each part of the cortex, and trying to unite all these things we think of as intelligence under one sort of algorithmic function. And that's what I basically describe as our research, trying to figure out what is that core algorithm that the cortex is doing. And to a large extent, we figured it out, or at least we figured out the basic framework of what's going on there. And it was different than we thought it would be.
Sure. And you also in this part, you take it the step further, and now you share some of the new discoveries and theories, and some of you say, I'm not fully proving this, but this is what I really truly believe is true, and this is why. So could you just take like a couple of those discoveries that lead to the 1,000 brain theories that you think are most important, and why would they be?
Yeah, so let me just touch on a topic you brought up there. All this work has been published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. So almost everything in the first half of the book is done that way. But I do, we're theorists, and as theorists, you posit theories, and some of them have now been tested and proven correct. Some of them have not yet, but some of them we can be very confident in, even if they haven't been empirically tested yet, because I explain in the book how this occurs, because there's so much, there's ways of testing things even before you do actual experiments on them. So I try to be honest about in the book which parts are more speculative than others. But honestly, Kevin, I wouldn't have put anything in the book if I didn't have a fairly high confidence in it. That doesn't mean there aren't things I would say in the future I would disagree with. But there's nothing wildly speculative in the book. There are things of like, well, I'm 90% certain of this one, or I'm 98% certain of that one, or like 80% certain of this kind of thing. So what are some of those big discoveries? Well, the most important thing, which is something that I figured out many, many years ago, and other people figured out as well, but it needs to be stated right up front, is that when we think about the neocortex, what is its function in the world? What is it doing? And it's tempting to think of it like a computer, right? You're getting inputs from your eyes and your skin, your ears, and the brain is processing it, and then you do something like a computer. But that's not really the way to think about it. That's not the right way. What the cortex does is it builds an internal model of the world. And so everything everything, every little detail, factoid that you have in your head, what things feel like, what they look like, how they sound, how they move, where they are in the world, every word, every concept you have, that is all in a model in your head. In some sense, the neocortex has recreated the world that you experience in this internal model. It's literally a model of everything you know. And so you can mentally move through this model. Just like I can say right now, you can imagine moving through the rooms of the house you live in, or walking down the street that you live on. You can do this because you have this model of this in your head. And you can say, imagine some particular thing like a stapler. And you can imagine that just because you have a model of it in your head. So the cortex builds this very complex model, and that's the world we live in. When we actually perceive the world, when we look out and see things around us, we're actually perceiving the model, not the actual world. It's a strange thing. So anyway, this idea, we have this model, and what the advantage of a model is, it allows you to know where you are, it allows you to plan the future, it allows you to imagine things like, how would I accomplish something that I haven't done yet before? And the model lets you do that. That's the number one big discovery. If anyone learned anything else from today, understand that your brain has a model of the world in it. And when we talk about beliefs, that model can be wrong. It doesn't have to be correct. The second thing we learned, I'll skip, there's a whole series of things, but I'll just give you two more. As I mentioned earlier, the different parts of the neocortex look identical. And the cortex is divided up in these things called cortical columns, which are about the size of a skinny little piece of spaghetti. And it's only 2.5 millimeters long. And you have about 150,000 of these stacked side by side in your neocortex. It's not, if you look under a microscope, they don't jump out like a bowl of spaghetti, but we know that they're there. There's ways of determining them. And we learned that each cortical column, and this is something we didn't understand, each cortical column, all 150,000 of these little pieces are doing the same thing. That was Vernon Malkassel's idea. But what they're doing is each one is building a model. Each one is building models of whatever its input is. So we have 150,000 modeling systems that each one's getting input from somewhere in the world. Imagine a little patch of your retina or the patch of your skin. And as it moves through the world, it gets input and it builds models of the things it's touching or seeing. And so it's a very distributed model. That was something we didn't understand. And then the final key piece, which is actually not the order in which we discovered them, but the order in which I'm going to explain them, is we understood the core of how the cortex, these little columns in the cortex, build this model. And this was a total surprise. We didn't know this 3 years ago. But what's going on is it's something we call reference frames. And I describe this and I give examples in the book. But you can think of a reference frame like a little 3D grid of a wire grid around something, or you can think of it like the lines on a map. It's a reference grid, right? If I have a map, I have these lines of horizontal latitude and longitude, and they allow me to specify locations of where things are. Well, the neurons in your head, in your cortex, create reference frames that are like that. And everything you know is stored at locations in reference frames. It's very much like how everything, a knowledge about a town can be stored on locations on a map. But your cortex is doing it. Each one of these columns is doing that in a very complex way, but they're building these three-dimensional structures that are using reference frames. And so that's probably the hardest concept in the book. But it can be understood. If you've taken high school math, you can understand it. And then finally, I just throw in one more thing. You know, we all have a singular perception of the world, right? We don't feel like we're 100,000 things. And why is it the world feels like one thing to me if I have all these little independent modeling systems in my head? And that's not because these columns vote. They try to vote. They vote to reach a consensus. So everybody's getting a little input from different parts of the world. Each one's trying to build a model of that part of the world. And yet they all vote to agree on what we're seeing. So it's like, okay, well, I think it could be this, I could be that. What's the one thing that could all be consistent with us? And it's voting through these long range connections. So, and that's what we perceive. We perceive the voting. We're not aware of all the independent debating that's going on underneath it. We only see the end result. That's when we only perceive the end result. So those are some of the big key items there. But when you tease it apart, there's a lot of fascinating things that come out of this. Why we see certain things, why we experience certain things, why we have false beliefs, things like that.
Yeah, and I had my last part was sort of a comment, and it's a reference frame. So it's interesting that, you know, that's where you because I found myself walking through the house, reenacting scenarios that are in your book. So with the coffee book, closing my eyes for directional awareness. And I'm assuming that as people are doing this, they're, reading the book, they're also sort of doing this because it's a great way to, really hone in and understand sort of the predicting and the modeling and the frames.
Yeah, you can actually, this is the thing where you can really experience yourself. I saw someone just asked about odor and olfaction. And I just point out, our primary senses are touch, vision, and hearing, and we can locate sounds and we can locate visual inputs. We can locate touch, somatic sensory inputs. Our sense of smell is pretty poor. And the cortex isn't really involved in that. Just someone asked this question. We have a very poor representation of smell in our cortex, and we don't really model the world too well with smell. Other animals can do that. So smell and taste are not really primary concerns in the neocortex. They're not primary concerns of how we model the world. So someone just asked that question. But the other ones, you can do it. You can walk around. You can picture yourself making these predictions and expect what's going to happen and how you move in the world and so on. Yeah.
Yeah. So in part two, so you is all about machine intelligence. And so you sort of make the case that our current computer artificial intelligence really isn't that intelligent. So could you please describe a little bit about sort of our current understanding, where we are currently in understanding and implementation of artificial intelligence today?
Yeah, so the field of AI has gone in its ups and downs over the years, over the decades. And right now it's a pretty hot field. And it's based on technologies which are called artificial neural networks, which are very, very loosely based on neurons. But the way these artificial neurons work and the way they're connected are not at all like we see them in the brain. And most AI today, and it's gotten really good at certain tasks, it's very task-oriented, like, oh, here's a neural network that recognizes images, or here's one that recognizes words. Very few practitioners of AI today will claim that these machines are intelligent. They don't, I'll give you several examples why they're not, but they're very, very inflexible. That's one of the most key things about it is if I have a machine that can recognize images, Well, it can't walk around and tell you what the scene looks like. It can't, drive a car. It doesn't understand what, it says, oh, I see an image of a cat, but it knows nothing about cats. It's just taking a pattern on a camera and equating it to the word cat. It doesn't know that cats have organs and breathe and have a heart, or that they have fur, or that they can be kind of funky emotionally, or there are cat people and dog people. There's nothing about that. So what we have in today's AI world is really some very, very sophisticated, what we would call pattern classifiers. And I don't want to demean it. I think the field is great. They're doing all this wonderful work, but very, very few people would argue in the field would argue that those machines are intelligent. It just imagine, there's nothing in the world today you can say, hey, I need something to repair this, faucet in my kitchen. Would you go to the hardware store and get something and bring it back and fix it? We are like light years away from that in the AI world, So there's really no understanding in this. I walk through the arguments, and I don't think these would be too controversial in the field of AI. That why our current systems really aren't smart at all. They're just don't. They're really good at certain tasks, but they don't have this sort of flexibility and general awareness or general knowledge that we expect out of a human. So that part's not too controversial. That I then lay out what I think is the right way to think about AI. And of course, I've felt this for 40 years, and I've been sort of a loner. Very few people have this opinion, but it's getting more common now that the only way to really truly build artificial intelligence machines is to understand the principles of how the brain works first. And once we understand those principles, then we can sit back and say, okay, well, how are we going to implement that? What are the, and so on. So I make the case that having a foundation, a structure for knowledge, which is these reference frames I mentioned earlier, and having a distributed modeling system, which is the columns I mentioned earlier, these are core components, not the only. Also, our brain, we learn through movement. We don't learn by just looking at images or hearing things. We typically learn by moving and touching and walking around and seeing things and manipulating them. And that's an essential part of intelligence and how we learn as well. And today's AI doesn't do that either. So I lay out an argument for the kind of foundational principles we would need to do AI. And that's, I do more in this chapter, in that section, but those are the two, some of the things I talked about. I also talk about the existential risk of AI, if you want to talk about that.
And that's what I talk, because my next question was going to be sort of about you detail a recipe for intelligent design machines, which you sort of have covered a little bit about. But yeah, let's skip to sort of the sort of topic you just brought up, because many science fiction movies show future computer systems, robots, controlling and taking over the world from humans. And there's some scientists today that warn about the risk of artificial intelligence. But you really, I think, share a very different vision. And so can you talk a little bit about your perspective of the potential threat, or the reason why there isn't an existential threat from it?
And here I am going to be more of a, this part of this chapter about the existential risk of AI is a bit more non-mainstream, if you want to put it that way. There have been many people, scientists, engineers, authors, philosophers, who are claiming that intelligent machines are an existential risk, meaning that they could literally eliminate humans, like either enslave us or kill us all. Now, let me be careful. I think AI, will be a powerful technology. It is a powerful technology, and therefore it is dangerous. Humans will abuse it, and humans will do bad things with it. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the existential risks of AI, that the AI systems themselves will wake up one day and say, oh, we're going to take over the world and enslave humanity. And there's a lot of people who believe that. But I think if you understand what intelligence is, and you understand the architecture of the brain, you reach a different conclusion. And we talked earlier about the older parts of the brain and the neocortex. The neocortex is the intelligent part of the brain, and it builds this model of the world. But the model on its own, it doesn't have motivations and desires and drives. And so if I build a machine with a neocortex, it can be really smart about the world. It can know all these things and how to manipulate stuff and do things, but it won't have on its own a desire to procreate. It won't have on its own get hungry or bored or these other things, these emotional states that humans have. And we, unfortunately, humans still have a lot of evolutionary baggage, which makes us do bad things. Right, so we people want to dominate and misogynistic and abuse other people and enslave people. All these things that are sort of our evolutionary history. That's not in the neocortex. Those are the older parts of the brain. So when we think about AI and the future of AI, we don't want to recreate humans. That's not the goal. We want to create intelligent machines that are useful to humans. And we don't have, those machines will not have those human-like goals and behaviors. They don't come, it's not something that comes about from being smart. They come about from surviving in evolutionary history for billions of years. But we're not, that's not our goal. So if you tease apart what intelligence is from the rest of our emotional or our evolutionary baggage, you realize that intelligent machines aren't themselves a threat. Unless we go out of our way to give them some of these old emotions and drives and make them angry at us and things like that. They're not going to do that on their own. So I make that case, and I'm pretty confident that's true. Although most people who've written about the threat of AI, they don't think about it. They don't realize these are separable functions. They haven't really understood what intelligence is. They just assume it's going to be like humans, which is not true.
Great. And I want to jump to part 3. So where, as you sort of led into human intelligence. And so this part of the book really covers a variety of topics, and it's a bit more sort of futuristic looking. And I think there's a bit of the more slightly depressing part of the book.
You're not the first person to say that, and I didn't mean it to be that way. I meant it to be somewhat uplifting, but not everyone sees it that way. Okay, so let's go.
It gets there. It does get there.
I get there at the end. I have to sort of introduce the reality, and then we can try to resolve it at the end there. Yeah. Okay.
Because you do talk about how we and our intelligence. You talk about our success, but how we and our intelligence are also a threat to our species and other species. So, yeah. So you do.
I mean, we are a threat to ourselves in the sense that our intelligence has allowed us to be so successful, and we've now been able to build technologies that can alter the world in very dramatic ways. Examples: we didn't go out to start doing this, but we're altering our climate in very dramatic ways. We can alter now we know how to reprogram our DNA in very dramatic ways. We've created nuclear weapons, which are really dramatic and dangerous things. So, and we're not done creating these things. We're going to create more of these sort of risks because we're smart, but unfortunately, we are still tied to our older brain parts and our older emotions. And there's a world filled of dictators and idiots who might threaten humanity. So, we just have to recognize that, our intelligence is paired with with humanity, with our evolutionary past. And that really does represent an existential risk. We really could either severely damage Earth, our societies, or even make it uninhabitable completely. We have multiple ways we can do that now, and we're going to invent some new ones, I'm sure, in the future. So I think it's okay just to recognize this. We shouldn't be, ashamed of it or anything like that, but we should at least recognize what those risks exist. And of course, I'm not the first person to point those out, but I think we can think about ways to mitigate them when we understand how our brains work, and we can think about alternate futures as well when we understand how our brains work.
And then the first chapter in this section, you talk about false beliefs, and which seems highly pertinent to the last 4 years, but I think it really is an ongoing concern for just humans in general. And I think what really struck to me is when you described, you sort of mentioned this a little earlier, we don't perceive the reality of the world. Our brain is showing us a model of the world that's it's interpreting. And I sat there and thinking about that, I'm like, yeah, that totally makes sense. But that also leads into how easy it is for us to have false beliefs and how easy it is for us to reinforce those on an ongoing basis. But you also provide a bit, and each one of these, a suggestion on how to think about those threats and sort of combat them. I wish you could share a little bit about this especially on false beliefs.
Yeah, so the false beliefs stuff can be very controversial, and you can really rile people up. I mean, here we are. This is the Secular Student Alliance, right? So the people in the Secular Student Alliance are generally non-theists, right? And we look out at the world and you can see all these religions, and they certainly can't all be correct, right? One could be correct. So we know we're surrounded by a lot of false beliefs, regardless of what position you take. You believe everyone else is wrong. And so we have to just acknowledge that fact. Oh my gosh, I lost track of what your question was, Kevin.
False beliefs, and how do we overcome them?
Oh, yeah. So I know where I was going with this question. So I introduced the topic by going very slowly through, very carefully talking about beliefs and belief structures that no one would find controversial, right? I give examples of just how we can get things wrong and how convinced we are of them. I'm trying not to be confrontational, especially with religions, although it comes up a little bit in the book. We're surrounded by these false beliefs. And I think my main goal is just to have everyone understand this, everyone understand that you might have this. And once you do understand the nature of false beliefs, it can be as simple as the following thing. I give examples of this. You can give the same set of facts to two people, and you can help them arrange them in two different ways. And you end up with different beliefs about those facts. That goes back to that reference frame idea, right? You have different reference frames, you end up with different beliefs about the same facts. And so we can actually get down to the detailed science about what it means to have a belief and why two people might have different beliefs about the same set of facts. We can understand that neurons do this. I think there isn't an easy solution to this problem. And I end the very book. I don't know if you want to jump to the end of the book or not, but I end the book talking about what we can do. And I might as well just throw it out right now. I think one thing we could all do, which would be easy and not controversial, hopefully, is that everyone can understand how the brain does this. We're starting to figure out the language to explain it to everyone. It's not that hard, how we form beliefs. And if everybody knew this, and I mean, so imagine if everybody was in high school, and you learn about DNA, and you learn about evolution, hopefully, and you learn about physics or basic biology. How does life come about? If we all learned about how our brain works and how we form false beliefs, and this is part of our common education throughout the world, then we'd at least have a way of dealing with our differences better. We would have a way of teasing apart what are our emotional states separate from our intelligence, and how it is that you and I might have different beliefs about something, as opposed to just saying, oh no, we're all right. No, we could all be wrong about something, and no one can be completely certain about their beliefs. So anyway, that's sort of the best prescription I can have for what humanity could do. But I also talk about things we can do that extend beyond humanity, extend beyond our species. I know you said it sounds a little science fiction, and I'm not a science fiction fan, but I do believe these are things we will do in the future. So that just makes it look a little science fiction.
You also talk in this section about how you're less concerned that computers and AI are an existential threat, but more sort of that humans are to themselves. Can you please talk a little bit about how you're more concerned about human intelligence, and some of that looks like the conflict between old brain and new brain is more of an existential threat?
Well, I gave those examples already. I talked about you look like the existential threats of nuclear weapons. That is our intelligence created those nuclear weapons, and we have created that. And now, the bad action of a few players in the world could really wreak havoc on this planet. It can make the planet uninhabitable. Our intelligence led to climate change, which is an existential threat. The fact that we are just overcrowding this planet because our old brains want to have children, have sex, basically. These all represent threats to us, and it's not like this is natural. This is what happens. But I think that's why we're so smart, and our tools and technology are so advanced that we've now been able to create things which really could destroy the Earth. And I'm not predicting that. And I make a point in the book saying, I'm not predicting doom and gloom, but we have to at least acknowledge it's a possibility, and we should be concerned about it. And that's where the Union Concerned Scientists put up this doomsday clock back in the 50s, I think it was. The threat of nuclear weapons. Because people recognize this. We really do have the possibility of creating problems. Even if and then you may find this depressing. I don't know, but as a species, we're evolving continually now, and species don't last forever. Humans will not last forever. Maybe we'll last for 1 million years. I don't know. Maybe we'll last for 10,000. Maybe we'll only last for 1,000. Who knows how long that is? And one of the things I talk about in the end part of this book is what could we think about our species if we just recognize the fact we won't survive forever. This, fine. There's nothing terrible about that. We can have great lives right now, but just start thinking about a future where what would we do differently today if we knew that in 1,000 years we might not be around anymore. And that's, I have a chapter called Estate Planning for Humanity. Which not everyone likes to do estate planning, but it's just I think these are thoughts these are ideas that we should talk about. Not that I'm predicting we're going to, doom and gloom, but these are things to talk about when we can, when we don't have these, we're not, in some existential threat of death right now. So I'm trying to expand people's conversations about what it means to be human, what it means to be intelligent, and what we might want the future to be.
Yeah, no, and I love the term estate planning humanity. But in your sort of last chapter of the book is genes versus knowledge, and this last chapter seems to be a challenge or a compliment to me to the first chapter when you're talking about old brain, new brain. So it seems, and this seems to be of this last section, you're most hopeful for the future of sort of human intelligence, humanity. So I'd love for you, as we're sort of going out, and we'll get to the Q&A, if you share a little bit about what you're thinking in that, and sort of the future, the good future part for humanity intelligence.
So just go back to the Secular Student Alliance. I think the people involved in your organization, I would hope, would appreciate this chapter more than other segments of the society, because it's really sort of a rationalist or realist look at humanity. Anyway, I've always felt, well, there's this last chapter, genes versus knowledge. I just make the point that we are here in service of our genes. This is an argument that was made by Richard Dawkins, who wrote the foreword for this book, by the way, that he wrote in his famous book, The Selfish Gene, many years ago, that the thing that replicates in the world is genes, and we are here our bodies evolved to support the gene replication, and our intelligence evolved because it supports gene replication. And so that's how we got here. We got here because we're gene replication machines, but now we're intelligent, and we're the first species ever to be able to say, hey, that's how we got here. We evolved. Oh, we're in this planet, in this big universe. These are the things that are happening around us. We're not the center of the universe. We can look at this. We're the first species to be able to do this. And so the question is, as we go forward in time, there are choices we get to make between, are we here to just make sure that our genes are preserved, or do we want to preserve our knowledge and our intelligence? And they're not always the same. And so we might choose in the future that it's actually what we really want to preserve is our uniqueness, what is unique about us. And what's unique about us is our intelligence and knowledge, and not our genes. We share genes with lots of other animals, and they're not really that special. But what's really special about us is our intelligence and knowledge. And so we asked ourselves, okay, in the future, when we have choices to make, and I go through some of these choices, we might want to choose to favor knowledge and intelligence over, preserving our genes. And this could, I don't want to get too sci-fi about it, but if we're going to send intelligent agents throughout the solar system and the universe, they're probably not going to be biological like us. And in some sense, our progeny, our children in the very distant future, might be intelligent machines or intelligent agents that are not based on genetic evolution. And that would be a very natural long-term goal of humanity in some sense.
Great. No, I really appreciate this. I want to get to some of the questions because we've got a number rolling through in the chat and in the Q&A section. And there's a few, John, and there's another John with no H, John with H. I have some multiple questions about how does your theory relate to Marvin Minsky's idea that's outlined in the Society of the Mind?
Okay, so I know it sounds similar. You can say Society of Mind, but if you actually read Martin Minsky's book, Society of Mind, you realize they're absolutely nothing to do in common with each other. Our theory is a biological theory, and we're talking about a common algorithm that's repeated throughout the neocortex, and we're explaining how neurons do that. The Society of Mind was the idea that it was a sort of, if you read that book, it's like every page is like its own little chapter. And Minsky wrote a whole series, I don't remember, dozens or 100 different little like vignettes about things brains must do, but with no biological basis to it, no explanation how this is actually implemented. It's a little bit more like musings about the brain. And when we know it's the exact opposite, instead of having lots of little things that are all different, which is what Minsky wrote about, we know there are lots of things that are actually almost identical, and yet it still produces all this variety of things we call intelligence. So in some sense, it's the antithesis of that theory, but they share a sort of common nomenclature, which is perhaps a little bit unfortunate.
Great. And Eric asked a question, and you talk about a sort of machine consciousness in the book. And Eric is asking just a little bit of a different question. So he says, based on our current understanding of how the brain operates, how do you think it generates consciousness, and what is consciousness?
Yeah, I have a chapter on it, and I was hesitant to write the chapter. In my previous book on intelligence, I wrote a little bit about consciousness, and people asked me to write more, so I did. And I put it in the machine consciousness chapter, but I talk about human consciousness there too. It's a very controversial topic. Many people believe that consciousness cannot be understood, that it's a non-physical phenomena, and so you really can't debate them about that. I don't believe that at all. There's nothing to suggest that's true. But it's also very difficult. There's many different definitions of consciousness, as there are people who write about it. However, I make a couple of points. I think I really get to the heart of it in this chapter. And I talk about two aspects of consciousness, and I'll just talk about them briefly right now. One is this sense of presence, the sense of me being in the world. I'm existing, and I know about myself. This goes by a lot of different terms and so on. And the question is, how do neurons do this? Well, it turns out your thoughts are activations of neurons. That's a fact. There is no separate mind from brain. It's when you have a thought, there's certain neurons that are active, and it's activating that portion of the model. And that's what you're thinking. That is the thought. And so as you go about your day, moment to moment, you have these different thoughts, different neuron populations are activating as you see things or think about things. But it turns out you can remember those activations. Just like you can remember if I see a new coffee cup, I can remember it. I can remember my thoughts. And the brain does this. It just remembers it. So now you have this, and the brain can recreate your recent thoughts and your present experience, and it can imagine the future. And it does this back and forth. So just imagine, for example, I get up to go to the kitchen because I want to get some ice cream. When I get to the kitchen, I had to walk down the hallway, I have to remember that I was thinking about ice cream. If I didn't remember that I was thinking about ice cream, I'd get to the kitchen and say, why am I here? Which we do occasionally. But the point is, in our normal life, we have this idea, we have this continual flow of activations of things that I thought about in the past, things I'm thinking now, things I'm imagining in the future, things I thought about in the future. And this gives you, and this goes back and forth. And so it feels like we're in this present when we're really just we are cycling back and forth to the past, present, and future, and we're recalling our experiences. And this gives you a sense of presence. It gives you a sense of why I'm here. What am I doing? What was I doing a moment ago? What am I going to do in the future? Why did I get up this morning and go here? All these things are just stored in your brain and you're recalling very quickly. The other issue that I talk about is something called qualia, which is a very interesting phenomenon. And I hope you don't mind, I'll take a second to talk about it. If you think about the brain, it's in your skull and it's dark in there. There's no senses in your brain. It's just this black box. And the only thing coming into the brain are these nerve fibers coming from the eye and the ears and the skin and other things. And those nerve fibers are all identical. There's no difference between them. Some of them represent light, some of them represent sound, some represent touch and so on. And yet you don't, sight doesn't feel like touch. I mean, I see colors and I see textures and touch has warmth and fuzziness and things like that. And so that's called qualia. Where do these sensations come from? And the reality is that the qualia, such as something as simple as a color, is a fabrication in the brain. It is part of the brain's model of the world. It's not something that actually exists in the world in the way we perceive it. So we have to explain how qualia come about. That's another part of consciousness. And I give some examples about how the brain will create qualia by modeling things in the same way it models everything else. I'm not going to get into the details of it. So we can tackle apart consciousness into some of its basic components and explain that there are legitimate theories about how these components come about. And it sort of demystifies the whole thing.
Great.
That's a long answer. Sorry about that.
No, it's good. So Ron is clearly read your book, and he says, with the problem of the human brain holding false models or beliefs, i.e. phantom limb pain or the earth is flat, he goes, won't AIG modeled on the human brain be susceptible to adopting the similar false models?
Yeah, it would be. It's a good observation. It's something we have to be careful about. By the way, false models are always aren't bad. I use the example of the flat Earth because belief in a flat Earth was a good model. It's actually still a pretty good model for everybody at the end of the day, to think the Earth is flat. We don't really need to know that the Earth is round to get about and do our jobs. So false doesn't necessarily mean bad. The best we can say is like the human brain can model only part of the world. It can't model the whole thing. We can't sense everything. And it can make mistakes. And AI systems will do the same. They're susceptible to that too. So we have to be careful about that. That itself doesn't, on its own, doesn't represent an existential threat to us, but it's certainly possible. And I think we'll have to learn to deal with that. We're going to have to learn to deal with it. So it seems inevitable, doesn't it? We'll have to deal with it. But, again, they're not going to be trying to dominate and use those false beliefs for enslaving people or to, take unfair advantage of humans and things like that.
So, and a little bit bringing it to more today's more social world, Mark says, hasn't social media been a key contributor to the decline in general level of intelligence as seen in the ongoing culture wars?
I don't know. I guess now you have to ask yourself what definition of intelligence you're talking about. I think as in general, I think about intelligence as being build this model of the world. And every human, you and I and every other human on this call here, we have this incredibly rich model of the world. And much of it built through language. And without language, we can only build a model of the world that we experience directly. Meaning I can touch and see myself. But if with language, we can learn about things we've never touched or seen. Things like outer space or atoms or, I've never been to Uruguay. Well, I think it's there. Why do I believe in Uruguay? Oh gosh, I'm off on topic again. What was the question again? I'm sorry. Oh gosh.
Social media.
Social media. Yeah. I don't think social media led to less intelligence. I think social media has led to more false beliefs. That is for certain, because people embed themselves in societies or videos or Twitter feeds that are just feeding the same nonsense over and over again. And you can form false beliefs that way. So I think social media really has, and especially the algorithms that are applied to social media, these ways they're feeding videos and stuff to people, that really has led to, I wouldn't say a decline in intelligence. I would say it's led to an increase in false beliefs and perhaps dangerous false beliefs.
So, and I know when I was reading the first chapter, I'm going, okay, at each point when you're talking about, the brain structure and starting to get numbers, I'm like, here's the 1,000 brains. Yeah. So Kenneth asks, he says, what's the origin of the title 1,000 Brains?
Okay. So, well, I'll give you two answers to that question. What it refers to is I talk about the book, when you model something like, I use the example of a coffee cup, and I say, well, where is knowledge about a coffee cup stored in the brain? And it's not in one model. There are many models in the visual system. There are many models in the tactile system. There's even models in the auditory system and so on. And these models vote together to reach the consensus that you're talking about a coffee cup. But so it's a distributed model. So the 1,000 brains refers to the fact that, like I say, well, where is something about like a coffee cup stored? It's not in one model. It's in thousands of models or 1,000 models. And that's what it's referring to. I mentioned earlier, there's about 150,000 cortical columns in your head. So there's a whole bunch of modeling systems, but they don't all model everything, right? Only a small subset will model anything particular. But everything is distributed under thousands or so models. That's where it comes from. That's what the name means.
Great. Harry asks, has your research led to any insight about how meditation works to calm the mind or change how we perceive and handle emotions?
Great question. I don't have any answer to that question. There's a lot of things we don't study. We don't study diseases of the brain. We don't study psychological or psychiatric disorders. We don't study meditation. We don't study sleep. These are all things that are really essential for humans. But we're more like, okay, what are the mechanisms by which the cortex, the neurons in your head actually know something? What does it mean to think? What does it mean to generate behavior? But there's a lot of stuff we don't study. And meditation is an interesting one that I really can't speak about.
Great. So John asks, he says, children are very willing to accept new beliefs, but as we get older, our beliefs become more resistant to change. Do you think that this change is plasticity reflected in how our brains work?
In some sense, yeah. we didn't talk about this, but the neocortex has different organization structures to it. And one of them is a bit hierarchical. So our model of the world is hierarchical. We learn some basic things, and then we learn things of those things, and things on those things. A simple example would be written language. We learn letters first, then we learn simple three-word letters and syllables, and then we learn more complex words, and then we start, and we build upon that. And so as we're getting older, what we're doing, we're building more conceptual knowledge on top of previous learnings. And you can't easily swap out the early stuff because the whole scaffolding will fall down, right? I can't one day say, there's actually 44 letters in the English alphabet, and they're different than you thought, and they sound different, and now we're then everything falls apart. And so in some sense, we form beliefs early on in life, and we build upon them. If you believe in ghosts early on in life, and you now build a whole infrastructure of beliefs about the world based on ghosts, well, it's going to be hard to change that fundamental underlying piece without having the whole scaffolding fall down. It's sort of like, I can't teach an old dog new tricks. It's not that the brain isn't plastic. We continue to learn throughout our lives. It's not that we're stuck, but the way the knowledge is stored is in a way that makes it very difficult to pull out the pieces at the bottom of the hierarchical stack. And that's why it's when people later in life they say they've lived their life as a very religious person, and later in life they decide they're not. It's a very a traumatic experience for them, and many people have difficulty with it. That kind of thing.
Great. And another question, more specifically about the book. Do you think that we can develop stimulus for the voting process you describe in the human brain regarding competing models and beliefs? So cognitive dissonance kicks in for humans at a lower threshold and a less painful process to challenge false beliefs or models.
Well, that's a complex question, and I don't think I understood it all, but there were some intriguing words in there, which could we stimulate the voting process, I think, which is the thing that jumped out at me. I'm not sure what the questioner asked, but I'm going to answer something related to it. I think it's a very, very interesting idea that manipulating that in a brain as a clinical tool in some sense. Not that we know how to do that today, but what if we could? That's a very interesting idea. But I'll have to leave it at that because there was so many ideas wrapped up in that question that I'm not sure where to take it. And I didn't really understand it completely. But I think one thing I can say in general, today we're developing all these new technologies, really cool technologies for both monitoring brains and interacting with brains. And that's going to continue to get better. And once we have a real theory, and this book is arguing we're starting to have a real theory about what intelligence is and what's going on. Once you have that, it leaves all kinds of new possibilities in the future. And I make a point in the book saying no one can predict the future, and I can't predict it either. But it's going to be crazy and wild and interesting because that's what the future is always like. And the idea that we might be able to have ways of helping ourselves in good ways by using brain theory and manipulative techniques to achieve results we want is very interesting. How should we train our kids? We send our kids to school, but we have no foundational theories about what's going on in their heads when they're learning, right? Well, we should have that, and we should design training curriculum based on that knowledge. And I think that's something that's going to happen in this century for certain. And so these are the kind of things we can look forward to, I suppose, in the coming decades.
Great. And I would say, I told Jeff before this started that he's, how are you, feeling good for today? And I'm like, yep, I'm ready. I said, I'm going through my questions because I have way too many. So, and even today I said, we got to about half of what I had written down, and there's a ton of questions here, but to respect your time and everyone else's, I want to end with just sort of one last question. And this is from Jesse. He says, how can secular students take the lessons and help people in their communities and society as a whole?
I mean, that's a very hopeful question. And, one of the reasons I love the Secular Student Alliance is because it's bringing down the secular values to an earlier age in life and making it more acceptable for everybody. And that's, when people see at universities and schools and high schools, when they see secular students, it just normalizes the whole thing. I think, I won't be able to give a good answer to that question, but I think I think just, again, as I stated earlier, just know, if we all knew the basic things, just that your brain is building this model of the world, and how the brain's model of the world is built on these reference frames, and you can take the same facts and get different results, different beliefs. That basic knowledge, if we could have more people understand that, at a dispassionate level, like we're not saying, oh, you're wrong about this, and this religion is stupid, or this thing is dumb, whatever, just like, no, this is the biology, right? It's not too much to argue about that. That in some sense, maybe I'll phrase it this way, we have been living through the enlightenment of our species for the last several hundred years. And the enlightenment means we're starting to understand more and more about the universe and our role in it, and the belief that we can understand it all. That's the essence of enlightenment. And the idea here is that if we could bring that sense of belief and discovery about, we can understand everything, and we can control our future, and we can understand how our brains work, we can understand why we have differences and so on. If we all knew that, if every student could convey that, like, to every other student, like, forget about what you're told, just talk about beliefs and how their brain works, and how we all might be, false beliefs about things. I just think it would lead to a better society. It's a bit hopeful, it's a bit, wishy-washy perhaps, but I do believe it. And so I think as a secular students, what they're already doing is they're pointing out that secular people are normal and smart and caring, and yet you don't have to be basing that on a belief system that is not supported by scientific evidence. And that's the core of the secular movement is. And so I think what we're already doing is great in that regard. I think just bringing a bit more science into the belief systems would just help that cause. So a long-winded answer, I'm sorry, but as best I could do.
No, I appreciate it. Just in the chat, I put the link to buy the book. So it was a very enjoyable read. It's a very easy, thought-provoking, like you literally read part of it and I sat and like thought for a day and then went back to the book because so I really enjoyed the book. And I also put the link to our conference. We invite everyone to come. Please, if you know other people who'd be interested, please share the link. But to Jeff, everyone here, thank you for participating. Jeff, thank you very much for your time. I really enjoyed the book. Thank you for spending time to share your thoughts and a little bit about the book with us.
Well, thanks, Kevin. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I appreciate everybody at the SSA, what they're doing. And so it's a pleasure of mine to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for all your support. We as you know, we very much appreciate it. So thank you for your time today. Everyone have a good evening, and we'll hope to see you at our conference.